The Magicians Podcast is brought to you in proud association with the Magic Circle, Alakazam Magic, and Gigio.
My goodness, are we coming back with a bang or what? Guy Hollingworth is in my hot seat on the Magicians Podcast.
It's been a long time. Come on. Yeah. Hey, yo, it's my life, my time, my rights, my rhymes, my grind, my struggle, hustle, sweat in my blood too. I'm ready to smell fear, I smell a lot. My competitors fled scared, cause they smelled I was hot. I want it all, excess, the sex, much success, stress us. I want it all, no less, so come on.
Yes, it is fantastic to be back. Welcome, friends, acquaintances, colleagues, let's be honest, a few enemies. Welcome to the Magicians Podcast. I am your host, Richard Young, and thank you for tuning in. For the next 12 weeks, here on this very feed, there will be a brand new episode available to you every single Friday with a different magician each week. We have some amazing people lined up over the next 12 weeks. The reason I've been away for so long is I've been waiting for the right magicians to be available to appear here on the show, and it was worth the wait. We've got some amazing episodes coming up, and I really can't wait to share them with you, starting with this one today, which is, I think, going to be a classic immediately. So how do we ensure that you don't miss anything over the next 12 weeks? Well, you need to do the following right now. Press the subscribe button on your device. If you've never done it, do it right now. It means your device will alert you every single Friday. It will remind you that there is a new episode of the Magicians Podcast available. And also you can connect with us on social media. On Twitter, we are at Magician Podcast, and we also now have a very active community on our Facebook page who love discussing the episodes as and when they come along. It is facebook.com/Magicians Podcast. If you do that, you will be all set. So, what's going on in magic at the moment? We've been away for a while, haven't we? But there's some interesting things going on. Impossible is going back into the West End in London throughout July and August. Looks like pretty much a brand new show. Some changes to the cast, and I believe it's the show that's been touring around the UK that's going into the West End. So it's a well-worked show. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. The show that I'm in, Champions of Magic, is also going to be in London in July for a short run from the 17th of July to the 24th of July. And it's part of the Just for Laughs festival. We're really looking forward to doing that. ITV have made an amazing TV series over the last few months. It's called The Next Great Magician. It was scheduled to be shown on ITV in July. I think I've heard rumours that it's been moved to September. They're very pleased with it, so it's been moved into a better slot in September when it will get bigger ratings. And I think this series could become a bit of a sort of classic TV series. There's about 30 magicians on it. They're coming in from all around the world. And unlike Penn and Teller Fool Us, which is great, but you know as well as I do that the magicians on there sometimes present odd tricks, a bit weird, to try and fool Penn and Teller. This is very different. It's a competition where the magicians are pretty much on the whole just doing their best things. I was at a couple of the recordings and some of what I saw was magnificent. This is proper big primetime ITV TV show with some amazing magicians. You won't want to miss it. It's going to be absolutely fantastic, and we're going to talk about it a lot here over the next 12 weeks. So it's time to get going, sit back, relax, and enjoy an hour in the company of one of the most brilliant magicians in the world today. His book, Drawing Room Deceptions, is a modern-day classic. I've been trying to get him on this podcast for a long time. Today is the day that I finally speak to Mr. Guy Hollingworth. So I'm here in a lovely house in London, and today has been an exciting day already because today I bought a new kettle. And now I'm sat with Guy Hollingworth. Here he is.
How's your kettle?
It's white and it's a hot point one. And to be honest, I've already got buyer's remorse. I think it costs too much. I'm going to take it back.
What you need to do is get one that's got adjustable temperature. Was it one of those?
Well, it's got buttons on the front. Also, there's a problem because I have bought
This is entirely... I'm sorry, but you started.
He's gone to get the kettle.
This is the kettle you want.
Oh, wow.
This is a KitchenAid artisan kettle which has an adjustable temperature gauge. So you can set it to 70 or 80 degrees if you want green tea, or 90 degrees if you want peppermint tea, or 100 degrees if you want...
See, I should have gone into a bit more detail. I have bought a kettle. I don't actually drink tea or coffee. I've bought a kettle because if you're making frozen peas for dinner, if you boil the kettle first, it speeds up the process. Rather than just boiling cool, lukewarm water or water from the tap on the stove. Instead, you boil the water first in the kettle, then you can put it in the frozen peas. You get frozen peas about 3 minutes quicker than the other way.
Can you boil the peas in the kettle?
Hey, that's a good idea.
Would that just cut through one layer of washing up?
What's in a kettle though? Would it all get stuck and there'd be like...
Well, you see, this one, I don't think it was designed with that in mind, but there's a button on it which opens, and it's got a filter at the front that would actually stop the peas coming out when you pour the water.
How much was this kettle? This looks like one. I should maybe take it back and swap it for one of these.
Well, it's a good question. I can't remember, and that's partly because I had a whole load of vouchers to use on Amazon.
Okay.
So I think it was quite expensive. I think I ended up paying about £40 for it, but I think it was like really expensive before that. I think it was like £140 or something, which you might think is a waste of time for a kettle, but since I had vouchers, I thought, well, hey, if I can make green tea and cook peas at the same time, that's got to be worth it.
That's interesting though, because you're a barrister.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that comes with a decent salary. I'm just a jobbing close-up magician. Let's be honest, my income's going to go down as the years go on. And I spent 50 quid on my kettle a minute ago, so I've definitely been too over the top with it. I need to take it back and get a cheaper one, I think. So, you're a barrister though. That's pretty good.
I am a barrister, and, well, you say I've got a salary. It's kind of you to say so. The weird thing about being a barrister is I'm actually self-employed.
Oh, you're self-employed?
Yeah, most barristers are. You can be an employed barrister, but the vast majority are self-employed, and we work in sets of chambers rather than law firms.
Right.
And so that means that I like that part of the job because it means that I can be, in theory, flexible. So I can take off. I took off a bit of time over August. August is a good time to take off because the courts are shut.
When you say flexible, are you really just using a polite word for a bit lazy?
Yeah, in some ways I am. It depends. There are times when you are really busy. That if I'm in the middle of a trial, you kind of can't do anything else. You've just got to be completely absorbed in that. And that can, the sort of work I do, because I do intellectual property, I don't do criminal work. I'm doing usually for companies.
Mind you, they are criminals, aren't they? Big companies most of the time.
Well, sometimes yes, it can be said, but I'm not in front of a jury, and I'm not doing long trials that go on for weeks. So a typical trial might be a week or slightly over, and probably 2 weeks preparation beforehand. So that can be a really intense period.
Yeah.
But if I'm not actually in court and I'm doing advisory work and I'm doing pleadings and paperwork and things, advisory work before I'm actually in a trial, then that I can in theory be a bit flexible with, and sometimes I might work a bit at home, and sometimes if I want to go away for a long weekend I can take a Friday off and then catch up on some work the following weekend. So it gives me a lot of flexibility, but it equally means you never quite know, a bit like being a magician, you never quite know what the next job is going to be or how much it's going to pay, and so I don't have a sort of a salary in that way, but it's variable but usually quite fun.
So I never met a barrister before, because actually, believe it or not, no one's ever. I've never been done in for anything. So, so I've got to ask first question.
Yeah,
you're a barrister. Did you watch The People vs. O.J. Simpson?
I got about 3 episodes in, and I couldn't bear it any longer.
Really? So Johnny Cochran's probably wasn't really like that. Do you think? Or what was it you didn't like about it?
Yeah. Well, where to start? I didn't. It's funny, sometimes when it's characters who are recent characters as opposed to historic characters, and they are sort of larger than life, so you know exactly what they're like, it can just be really hard to suspend your disbelief. I have a real problem actually suspending my disbelief anyway. I don't like going to the theatre very much.
Really?
Yeah, it's something I find quite difficult. I like things to be really realistic, and so I enjoy going to see films, but it doesn't take much to kind of pull me out of the moment. So seeing a programme with characters who are well-known actors, like John Travolta.
Yeah, he was great. Well, I thought he was great. Obviously you didn't. But...
Well, yeah. Someone like that then playing the part of somebody who you remember having seen on the news at the time, and O.J. Simpson not being O.J. Simpson, I just found, I mean, as a starting point, that's not a promising start for me. And then I just found it really quite clunky and not very engaging, and so I just gave up with it.
That's extraordinary coming from the guy who tears up a playing card and expects us to believe he puts it back together.
Well, it is bizarre because I don't know if that's to do with why I like Magic, but yeah, I do genuinely find it hard to kind of switch off. And when I first got into Magic, I mean, I've always been quite analytical, and I know it's a terrible thing to say because we're all supposed to go on about the art of Magic and it's not about fooling people and all that kind of stuff. For me, it's always been about the trying to work out how the tricks were done. That's why I got interested in Magic, and that sort of analytical thing of, I mean, I love being fooled, but for me, sort of the ideal thing is being fooled and then trying to work something out and then, finally getting there and figuring it out. That was what I used to love when I first got into Magic. So I think the idea of just sort of sitting back and watching Magic and letting the sheer wonder and astonishment wash over you, it's a laudable aim, but it's not something that I particularly have ever felt that's what I wanted to get out of watching Magic, so it's not particularly what I've consciously tried to do in terms of the Magic that I have put together. And I think that probably is part of my personality, that, as I say, I do tend to be a bit analytical, and so if I'm watching Magic or theatre or even TV or a movie, it does take quite a lot for me to really get drawn into it, rather than find myself sitting and looking around the theatre and looking at the lighting and thinking, oh, that's a nice set design or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've got to ask something, because you mentioned you're a barrister of intellectual property.
Yeah.
Something that occurred to me when you said that is often magicians fight over ideas and routines and things like that. Do you have a kind of different perspective on it? Obviously because you're involved in it with law. Do you understand why magicians get so precious about things?
Yes, I do understand. And yes, I'm often asked, can you protect a magic trick? And in principle, yes, there are some ways of doing it. I think sometimes magicians can be a little too precious. There's a general sense that if you've had an idea, then that's yours and no one else is allowed to do anything similar. In intellectual property law, most sort of magic things could, if anything, be protected by copyright. And copyright is a right not to be copied. And therefore, just because you've had an idea doesn't mean that somebody else is not entitled to do it if they come up with it independently. And indeed, it's often said that copyright doesn't protect ideas, it protects the expression of ideas. So just some sort of basic, very crude idea isn't protectable until you've actually put some form of expression on it and made it into something a little bit more real. And so I think sometimes magicians can get a little bit overly precious, that just because they were the first person to do some sort of a move and then someone else comes along and has come up with a similar move, if they haven't copied the first person's, then they're perfectly entitled to do that as a matter of law. But we all, particularly I think when we are excited about things, and whether we're hobbyists or professionals, you can become very enamoured with your own ideas, and some of them can be commercially valuable, or even if they're not, something you can just become attached to. So it's not surprising that people can get upset when people do other things, do similar things. And then of course there are times when people do try and rip other people off, in which case that's obviously not only something that can be said to be immoral, but probably is breaking laws as well.
Noel Qualter, because you did the panel show, didn't you, at thing. I heard a rumour once that he did a magic competition, used one of your acts, and he got £100 cash prize. If you want, I can make a call and get that money over to you. There we go. I'm good. So let's talk about you then, because I'll be honest, I'm not very interesting, to be honest. So let's go back to the very beginning.
Okay.
When did magic bite you? What age were you?
Well, I sort of was aware of magic and vaguely would watch the Paul Daniels shows, and I think I probably had a magic kit when I was, I don't know what age you are when you get magic kits, 7 or 8 or something like that.
Yeah.
So, it was sort of in the background, but I was never particularly interested in it. And then I went to senior school at the age of, I guess, 13. and there were various clubs and activities that we were encouraged to join at school. They were very much into sort of extracurricular activities and broadening your outlook on life and not just the academic side of things. And there was a magic club at this school, St Paul's School. It was called the Prestige Society. And I would have thought that that would have been one of the most popular things that everyone was dying to do. I mean, it sounds fun compared to the History Society or the Classic Society or whatever else. But weirdly, it had pretty well fizzled out, actually. No one used to go to it. And myself and one friend, we decided we'd go along, and we did. Just because it sounded, as I say, a little bit more interesting than many of the other things. And we had to fill in a form at the end of each term to say what extracurricular activities we'd done. So you had to do something. And we found out there was really nobody there, but we went along, and I suppose we talked a bit about magic, but it was a bit of a skive, to be honest, and something we could just sort of write down and say we'd done that. And it was on the same time as rugby practice, which I absolutely hated, so I could say I was at the Prestige Society rather than going to rugby practice. And so it was basically a scam. Until at the end of that year, it turned out that all of the clubs and societies were sort of expected to do something worthwhile, and I think there was an open day, in fact, that we were supposed to kind of do something for. Ooh. So we kind of had to do a show to show the fruits of our labours over the last year.
Please tell me you bought Bandana Banana.
Well, I didn't even know that such technology existed. This is the trouble, because I really had no contact with the world of magic at that time. You know, this was literally the two of us sitting in a classroom. I mean, I guess we probably went to a library and got the odd book, and I think we had a pack of cards and had learned the 21 card trick and that kind of stuff. But I had no idea of the world of magic dealers or anything. Mm-hmm. So I think I resorted to Norman Hunter's Book of Magic, which had various things that you could build yourself, sort of props for not too much expense. And so I did. I built some weird cardboard boxes that had flaps in them and put on a weird show with this friend.
Hang on a minute, so you did an illusion show?
I think that would be overstating it, if I'm honest. The boxes in question are probably basically shoe boxes that have been sort of made a little bit more magic-y. So nothing too grand in scale, or indeed effect or method. But we sort of cobbled something together, and we found we quite enjoyed it. And because that was the first time the Prestige Society had really done anything for a while, it generated quite a lot of interest. So then the following year, we had people coming and wanting to join the club that we were sort of by default the president and secretary of. So we ended up having to get to know more about magic and to sort of teach other people to do magic, even though we didn't really know anything about it. And at about that time, one of the teachers said he knew someone who was interested in magic, and this was a chap called Dennis Clark, who very kindly came and did a little show for the club, and it was a huge success. I mean, there were dozens of kids who came along for it. And so Dennis did this talk and then offered to take me to, I think, the Supreme Super Day, as it used to be, a small magic meeting in Lewisham. Yep. So I went along with him, and that was my first introduction to the world of magic and magicians.
So sorry, so what sort of age are you around this point?
I was about 15, maybe 16. Because soon after that I joined the Zodiac Club. I couldn't join the Magic Circle, so I was well under 18. And I think the Zodiac Club you could join at 16, so I guess I was approaching that age. So I used to go along to the Zodiac Club on a Wednesday evening, and I then met a lot of other magicians there. Richard Pinner and Peter Pinner and Peter Dudley.
I love Peter Pinner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard, not so much. But Peter, I love.
Yeah. I got to know a lot of the guys there pretty well, and that was really, as I say, my introduction. They had a library, so I could actually borrow some proper books as opposed to just the stuff that you found in the local general library, proper magic books, and Dennis lent me some books and introduced me to some people, and so I then got into reading the Larry Jennings book and various other things, and that really got me into sort of proper magic.
This is where it all begins, really, isn't it? Then
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then that was at about the same time as the Best of Magic was on TV.
Right.
And so that was sort of really good timing, in that was all the best magicians in the world were on this show, and I could watch those on a weekly basis, and that to me was really what made me become quite obsessed about magic.
So I've got to jump in because that's such a famous series. What stuff on that series really connected with you? Do you remember certain magicians on it that you went, wow, I really like that? Yeah, like I did when I was a kid. There were bits I would watch again and again.
Yes.
Was that the same for you? There were bits on it that really connected?
There were many bits that I enjoyed and watched over and over, and I mentioned that for me, one of the fascinations of magic was being fooled and trying to work out how something was done. So actually a lot of my kind of early learning, I think, was done by probably infringing copyright, as we talked about, by watching things and figuring out how it was done, and then actually
trying to recreate it,
albeit probably only for my friend at school. So that was how that was what really fascinated me about it. But to answer your question, there is no doubt there was one performer who completely made me want to be a magician, and that was Channing Pollock.
Yeah.
I mean, no doubt about it. And ever since seeing that clip from the Ed Sullivan show, I mean, that has always been my idea of what a magician should be and of what I always wanted to be, and that was absolutely my goal. And to be honest, I always wanted to do an act like that, a sort of stage manipulation act, and it was just kind of impossible or impractical for me to think about doing that as a schoolboy, and so I ended up doing close-up magic. And at around that time there was the Secret Cabaret, Simon Drake's program, which had Ricky Jay on it, and Ricky Jay also hugely influenced me, and that sort of got me into the close-up and the gambling stuff. So I think they were my two main influences, and I very much got into doing close-up and gambling things, partly, as I say, because it's just so much more accessible as a school kid. All you need is a pack of cards, and in principle you can do those sorts of things, whereas actually trying to put an act together, I never really thought I could do. So I got into doing close-up magic and then sort of parlour-type magic, I suppose. But I guess in many ways my heart has always been doing stage magic.
It's never too late, you know, to try and do. I mean, like, so was it the Dove act you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yes. You know, you would never think even now you couldn't maybe, you know.
Well, I don't envisage doing anything to do with doves.
I am aware that you've been learning something with billiard balls. Is that correct?
It is true. So I had, as I say, always wanted to do a stage act, and I've been talking about it for years and years. So as I say, when I was a school kid, it sort of wasn't a viable option. And then when I did do close-up magic full-time for a little while, I then decided I'd become a barrister. And I suppose at around that time, when it was becoming more of a hobby, I thought, well, I suppose maybe I could do a stage act at some point. And so I thought about obviously doing cards, which was actually particularly the part of Channing Pollock's act that I loved most, was the card sections. So I thought, well, I could probably do something to do with cards, I could probably do something with billiard balls. And I think I had in mind the idea of the sort of the persona and the style of magic that I wanted to do. So I knew there were certain effects that would fit it and others that wouldn't. So I started putting things together, and so I've been doing recently a new attempt at a stage act, which I'm very excited about. And
obviously for regular listeners of the podcast, they will know that Mike Caveney's episode, he talked about, he was very excited that you were going to go over to the castle, and I believe was that the debut of your stage act? Was that the first time you did it?
It was the debut of the whole thing. So I ended up going to South Africa in the latter part of last year, very much at the last minute, for all sorts of complicated background reasons. And it was partly to do with the fact that two of their main acts unfortunately had to pull out at the last minute. So I ended up filling in for Max Maven. And obviously, as a result, I thought, well, I should do a classical manipulation act, which is what Max would otherwise have done. No, but he was going to do something on stage. They were looking for a stage. They had a stage show booked, so they needed something that could be done on stage. And I had been working for a little while on some of these bits of an act, and I thought, well, I guess this is as good a time as any. I'll throw myself into it. So at very short notice, I thought, right, well, I can't do the whole act, but I can do about 2/3 of it. So I'll have a go. So I did it and really enjoyed it. The first time I did it, it was sort of in my mind, a bit of a disaster. I'm assured by people who were very polite that it really wasn't as bad as it felt to me, but I did drop a couple of the billiard balls at fairly crucial moments, so it felt pretty awful. But hey, that's all part of the process. And so I then, fortunately, the following times I did it on the show in South Africa, I didn't drop the billiard balls, and that was the sort of the start of it. But then as a result of doing that, I thought, okay, fine, I'm sufficiently close now. I'm really going to set myself a deadline. I'm going to say, right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to book a week at the castle. And yes, Mike had very sweetly been saying for years, whenever you do finally get round to doing the stage act that you've been talking about for 10 years, how about we do a week at the castle? And so that was something I really wanted to do. And so I got in touch with him and I said, look, because I'd actually taken some time off work at the time, and I was due to go back at the start of February. So I said, how about towards the end of that window, we'll see if we can get a week at the castle, and I'll use that as my absolute drop-dead point when I've got to do my act by then. And it all fitted in really well. Fortunately, there was a space open, and Mike and Tina were able to do the show. And John Lovick was the other act, and Christopher Hart was also involved. So it was a great team, and really, fun people to work with. And so that was the first time I did my act the whole way through.
Let's be honest, there wasn't a space. Someone got booted out, didn't they?
I don't think they did. I think actually, funnily enough, the close-up and the parlour tend to get booked up further ahead, I'm told. I don't know if that's true, but yes, no, there were limited opportunities, and it just happened apparently that week was
I often think when something goes through my brain and I'm trying to be polite and I shouldn't say it, I'm thinking, actually, I know the listeners at home are thinking, go on, ask it. So can I ask a little bit, what is in this act? Can you tell us a little bit? Obviously,
sure.
Not to ruin it, but, I want to know a little bit about the act. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes, by all means. I wanted to do an act that essentially was a classical stage manipulation act, but I wanted it to be sort of in the style of the stuff that I do, partly for my own self-comfort, and partly it just seemed, well, it's quite a big jump to go from doing close-up to stage, so why try and completely reinvent myself and do it in a totally different performing style? So I thought I quite liked the idea of doing some talking between the effects, but having the effects still done silently to music. The other thing that I tend to feel about a lot of manipulation magic is I think sometimes it's very confusing. I think it's sometimes unclear what the effect is. There's just clever stuff happening, which is nice to watch, but it's difficult to follow the thread of the effect. And sometimes that's just, I suppose, because manipulation magic is a bit like that. But sometimes I think it's because it has to be really fast and furious in order to be deceptive, because actually, you do a false transfer and the ball goes into this hand, but it's not, and therefore before the audience had a chance to think it must be in the other hand, or you produce it from under your elbow and then you turn it into a fan of cards, and there's so much stuff going on that you're left with this overall impression of, well, that was all quite cool and quite clever, but you can't really perceive what the effect was. So my aim, and goodness knows whether I've got anywhere near to achieving this, was to actually do a manipulation act, but with defined effects, so that you could actually say, well, this is a trick that involves 4 cards, and I'm going to put them into a hat, and then there will be a plot that follows from that, or a set of billiard balls, a traditional set of billiard balls like you used to have, which was 2 white and 1 red in a box, and you would explain the premise, and then the trick would follow from that. So that's really what it's about. So at the moment I've got 3 sections. There's a card section, there's a billiard ball section, and there's a newspaper section. And so I talk a little bit between them, and then the actual the performance is silent to music. And I'm hoping, as I say, that there is a discernible effect at each of those stages. And for me, there's something quite tidy about, we finish that bit, we put that away, and now we move on to the next bit, rather than a fan of cards and then a billiard ball and then another candle and a this and a that and everything else. So that's sort of how it works.
You're absolutely right, because I was very lucky to work on a show last year with a world-class card manipulator who's won loads of awards. and I got to see him perform in front of a 100% lay audience every night, and they didn't get it.
Really?
They just didn't get it. Yeah, they just like, it's amazing, and you watch it. It was a real lesson to me. It was the first time I realised exactly what you're saying, how confusing it is actually to the public. So it's amazing that you'd identified that, because actually you're a magician just like the rest of us. It's tempting, isn't it, to try and impress magicians with it and make it quick and flashy and all the rest of it.
Yeah, partly that's just not really my style. I couldn't see myself really doing that. I just think it wouldn't fit with me to be doing really fast movements. So I knew I wanted it to be fairly slow anyway. Not to say that it doesn't change in pace and there are faster bits to it, but yeah, I didn't want to do frenetic stuff where there was just loads of stuff happening. And so I think, having a fairly, hopefully clearly defined premise at least to the effect makes it a little bit more tangible and something that people can hopefully understand what you're purporting to do.
Yeah. You were a close-up magician professionally for like 2 years. Was it at that point, was it your sole income? Were you doing it literally?
Well, yeah, the short answer is yes.
At what point in your life was this, by the way?
So I finished school and then I took a gap year, which kind of everyone did at the time. I guess a lot of people still do. Partly I hadn't really figured out what I wanted to do and whether I was going to go to university, and if so, to do what. So I took a gap year, and that was the first time I went to America. Well, I'd been on family holidays, but it was the first time I'd actually been and visited the Magic Castle and been on a sort of magic trip. And so that really inspired me to do more magic, and I met a few people and I started to do a few shows during that gap year. So then by the time I went to university, and ultimately ended up studying industrial design for no particular reason, just sort of...
Which uni did you go to?
I went to Brunel University, which is supposed to be a good engineering type of a place, and it's in West London. There was actually a campus dedicated just for the industrial design course, which was on Runnymede Hill near Windsor, which was really lovely actually. It was a nice place. It didn't really feel very university-ish, that was the only thing. It was a small campus. But in some ways, I didn't really mind that, and so there was a student union, and I don't want to sound like a complete hermit. I did have friends, and we did go out and do sort of studenty things. But equally, there was some time when I would kind of be in my room and I'd be playing around and coming up with magic tricks and the like. And I would do a few shows, in the evenings from here and there. And so that helped to pay my way through university doing those sorts of shows. And in fact, it was a 4-year course, and you were supposed to do a work placement in the middle of it. And the university was kind of responsible for finding placements for all of the 120 odd students each year, which was really difficult to find places for 120 up and coming designers. Was really tough. So they were always...
I remember when I was at school, they had to send us all on work experience. That was difficult. The same thing. I ended up in the bakery in Sainsbury's.
Right.
Putting jam in the donuts.
Excellent.
Well, no, it wasn't really excellent to us. It used to smell brilliant though. Did you know that when you put jam in a donut, you literally slot the donut on a nozzle and then you press a button and it squirts it with jam? Did you know that?
I think I kind of possibly either knew or assumed that, because there's a sort of Japanese donut called a Papa Beard, I think, which I think is quite popular in America, and I think their kind of USP is that they do that in front of you, so you kind of get it freshly filled with some kind of custardy matter.
So you press the button and it goes in.
Yeah.
But then you can press the button again and again and again.
So
it just keeps filling up. So basically you end up with the donuts absolutely full of jam.
Huh.
That was the best thing that happened to me on my work experience. It's quite funny.
Yeah.
I imagine the person biting into that and, a lot of jam in there.
Yeah.
So what did you end up doing on your work placement?
Well, so here's the cunning thing. Because they were all a bit stuck about trying to find things for people to do, and because I was doing magic, I somehow persuaded them that really the benefit of doing work experience was to understand how a business operates. That's really, it's very unlikely that I'm going to work in exactly the same area as whatever placement you might be able to find for me. So in those circumstances, why don't I actually do 6 months actually running a magic business? And to my amazement, they thought that was a really good idea. So it had, as far as I can tell, no real relevance to the course that I was doing.
Did you laugh to yourself when they accepted that,
Well, I didn't really laugh at the time, but I did. The first thing I did was I went to Japan and did lectures in Japan. And this was quite soon after the Reformation Torn and Restored card thing, which I put out on a videotape. And to my amazement, they just absolutely lapped up anything that I had to sell to them. So I had a videotape which was available and some lecture notes which Tono Nasaka had very kindly had translated. So I actually made some money, which compared to the little tiny shows I'd been doing before, just doing the odd bit of close-up, walking around a table, was kind of amazing. So having done that, I was then able to go on other trips, and I ended up towards the latter part of that trip going to America and doing some time at the Magic. I don't know if I did a week at the Magic Castle at that stage, but I certainly went to the Magic Castle, and I think I was staying with Mike Caveney, and I also seem to remember I at some point ended up in a convertible driving down the Pacific Coast Highway in the summer. And at that point I did think, this has really worked out better than I could have hoped. I mean, this really is a good scam, because I'm supposed to be doing a work placement which I wouldn't have been getting paid for, and I would have been, doing making cups of tea for people in some grim part of...
Or putting jam in donuts.
Or putting jam in donuts. And in the end, here I was having a really amazing time. So, that was pretty cool, I have to say. So that was my work placement. And as a result of that being so cool, when I finished at university, I thought, well, why would I now want to go off and be a designer when I could actually be doing more of that kind of stuff? So I took, in the end, it was 2 years after I finished university, being essentially a full-time magician, which was a combination of doing the odd show, sort of close-up, walking around tables and that sort of stuff, and doing lectures, going to magic conventions, all of those sorts of things. So I didn't start off by thinking I'll do this for a period of 2 years, but during that 2-year period I found that was not something that I wanted to do to the exclusion of everything else.
This is the big question, I think. This is what I really want to know. This is the big question for me, is that around this period of time you are discovering, as I did and many other magicians, that you can make money by lecturing, by doing gigs. You were, let's be honest, by then you're already quite a big magic celebrity as well. Like, people, like you said, are lapping up your videos and things like that. And yet you made a decision and you went, no, I don't want to do this. I want to do something else. Why? Why did you? Because I mean, it's definitely, now I look at it and go, you made the right decision. You're a barrister, but you would have been in your early 20s at this point.
Yeah,
it would have been very easy to take the. I think some people would have said the obvious road, wouldn't it? To go, well, I'm making this work. It's a lovely way to make a living. I'm passionate about magic.
Well, I did take what seemed like the obvious route. I mean, it was not me being very strong-minded and saying, no, I mustn't do what I love. I must go and get a career to make my parents proud or whatever. It was nothing like that. It just, I knew the fun was coming out of it.
Already at that point.
Yeah.
And you're, like I said, you're a magic celebrity. You're doing gigs. You're...
well,
where was the fun going out of it? Can you sort
of... Well, I guess there are two aspects to the sorts of shows I was doing. There were two types of shows I was doing, I suppose. There were the close-up shows, which, if I'm honest, I've always hated. I mean, I never have enjoyed doing those. And when I say the close-up shows, I mean going around tables and entertaining at banquets or weddings or dinners or whatever.
So you did do those type of gigs?
So I did those. I did those. And I never felt I was very good at them. I mean, I got by and it was fine. I did my ambitious card and my this, that and the other. And, I tried to do some of my own routines in there as well. But I felt I was competing with things that a lot of the guests thought were more important, and probably were, like the dinner and their conversation with their friends and all the rest of it. And I just never got anything out of that. And I kind of dreaded doing it. And that's not why I got into magic, and I felt I had to do them because it was my living, so I didn't really have the luxury of saying, I don't fancy doing that. And I just genuinely didn't really enjoy it. What I did enjoy was going to the magic conventions and doing the lectures and those sorts of things. But even that, I found surprisingly hard work and surprisingly demoralising at times. I mean, it's very kind of you to say magic celebrity. It certainly didn't feel like that at all. You know, I mean, it's nice. You're always very welcomed when you go to places, and it's very, very nice when people know who you are and have read a book or something. But ultimately, you're going to a magic club and doing what you're doing for a group of people, which hopefully they enjoy. But in the course of doing a lecture tour, I did a tour in Austria. And again, I mean, this sounds like I'm ungrateful. Not at all. I was treated extremely well. But there were times when you had to drive for 6 hours to get to a magic club, and you got there and there were 8 people in the audience, 4 of whom did children's magic, which, you know, why shouldn't they? But my sort of thing isn't really of much interest to them. Another 2 guys who are the sort of the vice president and the secretary of the club, who don't really want to be there and are dozing through the lecture. And so you're basically doing a lecture for 2 people, one of whom is 16, so can't afford to buy your lecture notes. And so you do a 2.5-hour lecture, you make no money out of it, you don't feel anyone's really got much out of it, you've had to drive all the way, and then the next day you've got to go somewhere else and do another thing. And so that's a bit of an extreme, but equally I found it less enjoyable the more I did it, and I didn't find it particularly stimulating, doing the same thing over and over. Now, I think that a lot of that was my shortcomings. I'm sure if I were doing it full time, and I've thought about this more recently, if I were to do it on a more full time basis in the future, I'd be looking at doing other things. But at the time, the things that I was doing were things I realised I didn't want to do for the next 30, 40, 50 years. So it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't any kind of denial on my part of, I mustn't allow myself to do this thing that I love. It was naturally a question of finding something else that I could do that would allow me to keep magic as a hobby.
And can I ask then, has the opposite ever happened, where obviously you did become a barrister, and I'm sure there are times where that's a high pressure job, and
sure.
There have been times where you wish you'd kind of just been a magician? Has it ever gone the other way?
Absolutely, yeah. No, there are times when it's really hard work and you're working till the small hours of the morning or over the weekend, or something is really high pressure, and you think, why am I putting myself through this? But ultimately, in anything that you do, I'm sure there are going to be highs and lows, and I wouldn't say that's really part of the reason. But I took a 6-month sabbatical last year, not because I was desperate to get out of being a barrister. That wasn't it at all. But I felt I hadn't been doing
lazy
because I was lazy. Yes, I felt I hadn't been doing as much magic as I wanted to, and I just thought I'd like to sort of reconnect with doing magic as I used to. So I was able to arrange 6 months off. I had to plan it quite some way in advance, but that's another benefit of being self-employed. And so that was absolutely wonderful. And I worked on my new stage act, I travelled quite a bit, and I had a fabulous time. And it was a good confirmation that I don't want to do that full time at this stage, but I do want to make sure I've got some time to do magic in my life alongside being a barrister. I think when I started at the bar, I was a bit concerned that people would think I wasn't taking it seriously if I sort of went off and did magic shows. And I think now I've been a barrister for long enough that hopefully I'm taken moderately seriously. People don't think I'm a joker if I'm going to go off and do a magic show. Obviously the people I work with know, but most of my clients know that I do magic as well. So I think I've got to a stage where if I do decide to do the odd show in the evenings or the weekends, or take a week to go and do a little run in a theatre or something, and I factor that in so it doesn't clash with work, that should be fine. And I think that's really what taking the time out allowed me to realise.
The Magicians Podcast brought to you in association with the Magic Circle, the world's premier magical society. Are you ready to join the world's most exclusive magic club? Visit themagiccircle.co.uk to find out more.
Gigi-O, free for 30 days. Be a pro, get Gigi-O.
The Magicians Podcast is supposed to enrich your life, and Gigi-O will do the same. It will save you hours in the office every single week. It generates PDF contracts and invoices. It tracks your payments. It updates the diary on your phone automatically, and you can even schedule emails to your clients. All the top professional magicians in the country use it. You can visit the website right now, gigio.co.uk, to read what they all say about it, and also take a free 30-day trial. You can run your entire business on Gigio, all on the web. Visit the website right now, Gigio, spelled gigio.co.uk.
Whether you're new to magic or a seasoned professional, Alakazam Magic are here to help. Alakazam have been supplying magic to magicians for well over 20 years. Not only do we carry all the latest and greatest magic tricks, books and DVDs, but we also manufacture one of the finest ranges of magic tricks in the world. The Alakazam name is synonymous with great customer service, educated advice and honesty. So if you're shopping for new magic, make sure you check out our website, www.alakazam.co.uk, or pay a visit to our fully stocked shop.
Is it one of the reasons why you haven't done so much telly? I'm sure there have been TV shows that have come along that have offered you slots. Have you decided to turn TV down sometimes because of your day job?
Partly. I've never particularly had a huge urge to be on telly, which is in some ways a bit silly because looking back, I think there's no doubt that the very fortunate opportunity I got of being on World's Greatest Magic, which was literally just happening to be in the right place at the right time, was an enormous boost to what I then was able to do. You know, it was the first time I'd been able to be exposed to that number of people, and I think that did raise my profile and allowed me then to do the lectures that I was talking about earlier. So there's no doubt that it's a very powerful tool, and so I'm very grateful for that, but probably it isn't much of a surprise given what I've said that since I don't now see myself wanting to be a full-time magician, I'm not actually looking to promote myself, I'm not looking to get more gigs or anything else. There's no particular reason for me to want to be on TV, and I think once you've done something on TV, I don't know if it's true to say that you've sort of spent that. For instance, I mean my new act, for instance, I would have absolutely no interest in doing that on TV until I felt, well, I've sort of done that and I don't want to do it again. So it just hasn't particularly appealed to me, which I quite like that, because every now and then you do get approached and still people kind of assume that everyone wants to be on TV, and when you say, actually it's really kind of you to ask but I don't think it's for me, they're sort of a bit bewildered, and that's quite fun.
Yeah. Talking about the World's Greatest Magic, that's the first time I saw you. Okay. And I think it was voted the 47th best magic trick of all time on that show that Owen and his mates made, I think. And that clip, you mentioned you were in the right place at the right time. How did that come about, you being on that show?
Essentially, I can't remember quite how it fitted in. I think I was in LA on my very rigorous work experience for my industrial design course.
Lazy.
Yeah. And I mean, I was very lucky in terms of the people who I was introduced to and who I met. While I was still at school, I went up to the Blackpool Magic Convention and I met David Williamson, and I was thinking about going off to America during my gap year, and he incredibly kindly said, well, make sure you look me up if you come over, and so I gave him a call and he put me in touch with some other people, and so I got to meet some really great people early on, and at some point that included meeting Gary Ouellette, who was he the producer? I'm not sure exactly what his role on The World's Greatest Magic was, but he was certainly very influential in it. And so he had seen me doing this Torn and Restored card, which he seemed to like. And I think also they had done a couple of these programs, and it was called World's Greatest Magic. And I think, as sometimes happens with American programs, they can be a little bit US-centric. So I think they were kind of in the market for English-speaking but non-US magicians, perhaps, to make it a little bit more world's greatesty rather than just America's greatesty. So I guess, as I say, I literally was in the right place at the right time, and Gary put me forward for it, and I ended up doing it. And it was bizarre looking back on it, because I had no idea it wasn't a programme, I think, that was shown in the UK contemporaneously. So, you know, the previous ones, I hadn't seen the previous ones in the series. And I had no idea of whether it was a big deal or not. And I went out to record it. And, of course, they recorded the individual sections separately, so I wasn't in a big, huge audience, you know, stage with a big audience. I was just doing a small spot in what was then Caesar's Magical Empire. And I came back and went back to university and completely forgot about it. And I remember getting up one morning and going into a lecture and writing the date at the top of my notes, as I used to do, and it was the 24th of September or whatever it was. And I just thought, that rings a bell for some reason. And I thought, oh yeah, that TV's going out, that TV programme's going out tonight. And of course that was before, it wasn't strictly before internet, but certainly the internet wasn't what it was now, so you didn't get this sort of instant feedback. So it just sort of happened, and then, you know, several days or weeks later, I went to a magic club and someone said, oh, I saw you on TV or whatever, and I had no idea that it was actually quite a big programme that had been seen by a lot of people. So it was a kind of surreal experience. It just sort of happened without me really realising it.
Many years ago, you did the Edinburgh Festival. And you did an Erdnase show. What's the story of that show? How did that come about? You deciding to do a show at the card table?
It was a complete accident, and that was courtesy of Paul Wilson. So Paul at the time was living in, was he living in Edinburgh or Glasgow? I can't remember. He was living in Scotland at the time, and he used to do a show at the festival most years. And I remember he had, the previous year, his show had been called Sharp, which was a kind of play on card sharp. And he mentioned that hadn't been a great success as a title because there are so many thousands of shows going on there that people flicking through the brochures, you know, that you need to have something that instantly tells you what the show's about. So he decided to put on a show called The Expert at the Card Table because it was a more immediate title that told you more about what the content of the show was going to be. So he had that all arranged, had a nice little venue, and the brochures for the whole festival had been printed with The Expert at the Card Table will take place at such and such a time. And then he ultimately couldn't do the show at the last minute. Work got in the way. And he called me up, and because I was at university at the time, so I had that period over the summer off. He said, I don't suppose you fancy doing a show at Edinburgh? And I thought, well, yeah, why not? So I went up there, and he said, oh, by the way, the only thing is if you're going to do the show, it's going to have to be called The Expert at the Card Table because the brochure's already been printed. And I didn't really know a lot about the history of the book at the time, but I had some vague recollection that I'd heard something about the Milton Franklin Andrews story. And I mentioned it to my friend Chris Power, and he said, oh yes, I've got a copy of The Man Who Was Erdnase. So I picked it up from him on the way to the airport. So on the flight up to Edinburgh, I was flicking through this book and thinking, wow, this is really cool. There's this story about this guy who's like a murderer and a wanted criminal who might have written this book. So on the first night of the show, I basically just did my card tricks, and in between the card tricks I would say, you know, this show, The Expert at the Card Table, it's actually the name of a book, and then I did another trick, and you know, the book I was telling you about, it turns out it was written by this really interesting guy, another card trick, and you know, as well as being a card sharp, he actually murdered these people, and these are the sorts of things he did, and so it was completely ad hoc, but I found people were sort of more interested in that than my magic, which probably tells you about my magic, but you know, that was every bit as interesting as the magic stuff. So as the show developed, as the weeks went on, I kind of had something a little bit more structured and really made it into, I think, a bit more of a show which had something to do with the book. And then when I saw that there was some potential there, I tried to actually kind of rework it into a sort of proper show, which to some extent I did, but it was then really quite a few years later that I really kind of revamped it, and I really wrote a proper script for it. And that was when Neil Patrick Harris got involved as the director, and we sort of actually made it into a kind of proper show. And we went back to Edinburgh in 2008, which was, I guess, 10 years or so after the first time I'd done it. And it was a completely new show then, which I think kind of was a proper show at that stage. And I've done it since in various places, and I hope to do it again.
That's really interesting. So you do enjoy doing that. We were talking before I pressed record here on the microphone that if you one of the things you would probably want to do is do somewhere where you're doing your own show. That would pull you away from Laura a little bit. But would you want to do that type of show, or would you want to do your new act, or maybe a mixture of the two? Or
Yeah, if I was going to do magic on any sort of extended basis, then certainly that would be the kind of thing that I'd be interested in doing. So at the moment, I have no desire to give up the day job. And I did do the Expert at the Card Table for a 4-week run in Los Angeles a few years ago. So it does seem to be possible to slot things in that way. And yes, I would be looking for... that's the sort of thing that would very much interest me in doing either a run like that or doing my stage act. It's partly seems terribly egocentric, but it's nice to think that you're doing a show that people want to see, and people have actually come to see you and the show that you're doing, or at least to see a magic show that you're a part of, as opposed to what I didn't like about what I was doing previously was kind of going up to people unexpectedly at a cocktail party or at a restaurant or at a dinner function and thrusting magic upon them. So yes, that's absolutely the sort of thing that I would like to do more of.
Amazing. So let's talk about your book, which I've got sat right in front of me. Obviously, no one can see it 'cause it's a podcast. So, do you mind me asking, how old were you when you wrote this book?
I guess I was 24, 23.
I mean,
something like that.
It's amazing, isn't it? That, like, at that age, you had this amount of work and everything. There's two things in here I want to really talk about. The Waving the Aces and the Reformation.
Okay.
First question I've got to ask you. Obviously, it's been a long time since you wrote this book. Have you changed the way you do the Reformation at all since this book was published? Or is it still very much similar to the way it's published in here?
It's still very much the same. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. That comes back to me being lazy. People sometimes ask me, because there have been, unsurprisingly, people have other versions of Torn and Restored cards, and I dare say there are many different and better versions to mine, and people ask me whether or not I've tried other people's versions, and the answer simply is I kind of haven't, because I've just got so used to doing it. There comes a point where you just don't even think about it, that I would find it so difficult to change it. And I say that is kind of lazy, because objectively you ought to be constantly thinking, can it be improved? And I sort of just haven't really done that, I'm afraid. So it's an odd thing, because it is, I think, a difficult trick technically. I mean, and I remember when I was working it out, I remember not knowing if it was even a half decent method, because it looks so rubbish. And sometimes I think when you're coming up with something, it's difficult to know whether something looks bad because it's a bad trick, or because you just haven't practiced it enough. Because, if it's someone else's trick and it looks good, you then have the motivation to keep on practicing it.
Yes.
But this is one of those things where I really didn't know if it was decent. And even when I sort of had practiced it and I started doing it for friends and doing it at magic conventions, I genuinely didn't know, is this okay? Does this kind of look even vaguely like what it's meant to? It's kind of hard to know. But having sort of got through that to the stage that now I kind of do it without thinking, I can't really contemplate going back to make changes to it, which is, I say, not a good thing, but there we are.
So just be clear, because I tried to learn this once, and by the way, it's nothing to do with the problems with the instructions. It's absolutely my terrible abilities as a card magician. I find it difficult to learn just because I'm rubbish. But you've got to a point where you don't have to think doing it.
It's kind of really weird, but and I mean, this is me setting myself up for a fall here, and next time I do it, it'll go hopelessly wrong. But if I don't do a show for a while, then obviously before I'm going to do a performance, I'll kind of do a little run through and a rehearsal, partly just to do the mechanical stuff and partly to get the performance and everything back up, hopefully. And it is just that trick I have done so often that I kind of, when I'm doing a run through of the effects that I'm going to do, I just don't even bother to do that now, because it just happens so much without thinking that even the other things that I've done a lot of, I still will go through them a couple of times to really feel comfortable with it.
Yeah.
But it just is one of those things which seems to have just sort of stuck. So I guess if you do things long enough, that does sort of happen. So with most things, I kind of feel I do need to keep running them in, but that one has kind of just stuck in there.
Why did you decide to look at the effect? Was there an inspiration before? Obviously, there were other Torn and Restored card effects around. What was it that when did you start creating your own version of it, and how long did it take to get to the point where it is now, where it's published in the book as a complete routine?
I don't remember precisely. It was certainly in some ways connected to the David Copperfield baseball card,
Yes.
Torn Asunder, and the sort of piece-by-piece restoration. And I imagine I must have seen that and thought I would like to be able to do that I have no idea how that trick was done, by the way, but I'm fairly sure it's not a method that could be applied to a sort of normal performance situation. So I thought it would be nice to do something like that where you can actually see the pieces going back together. And I started with J.C. Wagner's Torn and Restored, which is an absolutely great method, and you ultimately tear off 1/4, although it appears you're tearing the whole card up. And so you then put, in the original version, it goes back in one go, and you've got a 3/4 card, and you can show that the piece matches. So I set about trying to see if I could do that trick as a piece-by-piece restoration, which I did, but you still had the last piece that didn't go on. So the first part of the idea was to do it in a visual restore. And I had all sorts of hideous kind of patter presentations to try and justify not putting the last piece on. But of course, doing the visual piece-by-piece restoration made it even worse not putting the last bit on, because it's just the obvious conclusion. So I kind of thought, nevertheless, that seeing the pieces restoring one piece at a time was worth pursuing. So I just kind of through brute force just tried over and over different ways of folding cards and different numbers of cards and different quantities of cards. And actually the method I ended up with, in some ways it's quite simple in terms of just having one extra card which is just folded in quarters, so there's not some huge preset, which makes life a lot easier. Again, I found this with my stage act. Having a method which is relatively straightforward just makes it so much more accessible, because you can just practice it over and over again without having to stop and spend half an hour resetting before you can do another run through. So just being able to fold up 20 cards and then do the trick 20 times is a good way of sort of getting through it. So that was really all it was, and that was one of the things I did come up with at university. I mean, I remember quite clearly being in my room at university and coming back from a lecture, and before going out to the pub in the evening, that would be when I'd just tear up a bunch of cards, and there was a little mirror above the sink in the room, and I'd just do it and make a bit of progress and come back to it a few days later.
The signature is genius. The idea of the signature, was that something that was added straight away? Was the idea of the signature, and of course the secret part of, I won't ruin it, but there's obviously part of the method is to do with the signature as well. Was that added early on or late on as a last detail?
I don't really remember, if I'm honest. I think it was there kind of from the beginning, because as I say, I was influenced by Torn Asunder, and my recollection is that the baseball card was signed, wasn't it? And then it was peeled off.
You don't know this because we don't really know each other, but I'm a big Copperfield fan.
Right.
And so I know all of his work inside out. And the baseball card had the signature on it. Do you remember at the end he peels the signature off?
Yeah, exactly.
Was it Chris Kenner came up with the method for
Chris Kenner, I think, came up with the Torn Asunder method, but I think it was David Williamson's signature, peeling the signature thing off, that was incorporated into that, is my recollection.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I think I did do that. So I think in order to kind of complete the circle, as it were, I did do the version as it basically now appears. And I think I then did some kind of a top change or a switch, I can't remember, for a folded card with the letter line on it that you could then peel off, so that the card would then actually be restored, and possibly even ironing out the creases, which again was from the David Williamson thing. But I concluded quite early on that actually the folds in the card, although we know that is actually the method, the folds are actually where the magic has happened. That's actually where the card has fused back together.
Yeah.
So when you give it out to people, they're actually bending the card and at the folds to try and see whether it really is restored. So it's actually a much more magical object to give to someone if it's still folded and with their signature on it. I mean, that last piece obviously is the kind of the real seller, because people can fold that card as much as they want to, and they're never going to be able to fold it in a way that it will look like a 3/4 card.
Yeah.
So yeah, I left it at that.
The other one that I love, the book's amazing, but these are the two that I tried to learn, really, which is why I'm most fascinated, was the Waving the Aces as well, which we talked about before we started recording. You put out as a separate booklet with the card as well, didn't you?
After the book, I did, yes.
Yeah. How did you come up with that? Is that based on something before it, or...?
Again, a lot of these things around this time were... And this is a time, as I say, when although technically the internet did exist, it was a pretty clunky thing that sent emails, and there wasn't the sort of YouTube and all of that. So it was still in a time where you would hear rumours about things, and I remember being at magic conventions at the time, and particularly in the States, and hearing that somebody had a version of Twisting the Aces where the cards turned over visibly. And I suspect, looking back on it, that was probably Lee Asher and the Asher Twist. But all I'd heard was this idea of Twisting the Aces where you could see cards turning over. And so I just thought that sounds really cool, and I just set about trying to find a way of doing it. And the original version was a close-up version, which had sliding cards and sort of worked. And then when I was asked, Chris Power and JJ asked me to do a lecture very kindly at one of the Isle of Man conventions, and that was really the first time I'd done a lecture, and I realised very quickly that this was an item I wanted to put in it, but no one was going to be able to see it because you really do have to be pretty much overhead. So I tried, standing on a chair, and it just didn't work. So it was really out of necessity. I thought I need to find a way of doing this in a way that people can see it. And that was a really important moment for me because it made me realise that so many tricks that you do kind of at chest height, which is where, at waist height, which is where most close-up magic happens, can be, I think, improved and adapted by bringing them up to a position in front of your face, which makes it much easier for people to see it, not just in a lecture, but in any performance situation. I mean, even doing close-up walking around tables, I just think it's easier for people to see up there. And I just think also that really helped me to get much more into the performance. I mean, I'm not really, I'm not a trained actor or anything like that, but I think nevertheless being more aware of your audience by actually standing and looking at them and making eye contact, whereas when you're doing Elmsley counts and things and your head is down, you're just not so much into that. So I think that was really a moment that changed a lot of my outlook on performing in the style of magic. And so yes, that was when that happened, and then subsequently I had this little extra twist where they would change into aces, and that was something I put out separately.
So this book was published back in the 90s.
Yeah, I think late 90s.
Long time ago. You say yourself you're lazy. Will there ever be another book? Have you got more material that's written up somewhere in a notebook that perhaps they're...
I have got some more material, and I very much want to do another book. I don't think I've got... I don't like books that contain material that has never been used, that's just sort of either B-list stuff or stuff that is theoretical, but you've never actually done it. So even if I could scrape around for enough material to put into a book, I wouldn't want a book to be like that. So I have got quite a few things that I want to put in, but I think probably not enough for a whole second volume. So I am actually thinking about it quite seriously now, and I have been working on some new material with that aim in mind. And I'm kind of thinking that this one might have some non-card items in it as well. And Mike Caveney has said he would be interested in publishing the second volume. So
we don't need to wait for it to be a book. I'm happily read a leaflet or something. Depends what you got.
Well, a little tentative toe in the water was some lecture notes I did for FISM last year, because I thought it kind of is pathetic that I've been doing the same lecture for like 15 years or something, and it really is about time to do some new stuff. So I really did think I've got to put together some new material and write it up into a new set of notes. So I did that for FISM last year. So yes, it's not impossible. I might put out a few little booklety type things, but again, I'm in no particular hurry to do that, and I just think nowadays, I don't know what the market is. I've got no idea. Do people buy booklets? Don't people buy downloads and things?
I have no idea, to be honest. Yes, it's mainly DVDs and streaming.
Well, I think DVDs are, I'm told that's even yesterday's technology. It's all streaming and downloads and things. So, there's just something nice about a book. It sort of feels like it's an object that's worth having.
Well, it's also the fact that I've still got it as well. Yeah. Like, if you log into a website, you just, it's not in sight, is it? So that you see it again or remember to revisit
I
it
guess that's
potentially.
true.
Whereas if it's a book on a shelf, you might actually, I wonder if it's in that book.
Yeah.
You sort of remember it a little bit more.
And it's a bit like what you asked about being on TV, and I don't particularly feel the urge to do that. I don't particularly feel the urge to put out a booklet with one trick in it, because there's just not an awful lot of point. I'm not going around doing lectures and looking to sell things, but actually putting a book together, well, that's an attractive proposition. So I think that's probably what I'll do. So yeah, I hope so.
Obviously, our friendship here is blossoming, and by the way, your friends were going to go to Thorpe Park recently, and I know
That's true. Yes.
I know it's been rescheduled.
Was that today we were due to go?
I think so.
Yeah.
But I was going to go too, by the way. Just
Exactly.
So
yeah.
Maybe when it's rearranged, me and you could sit together on Air or something. That ride.
Well, Air is
That's Alton Towers, isn't it?
And Air is no longer Air.
Are you a big roller coaster mark?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Air is now, I'm told, the first virtual reality roller coaster. You now put on a headset, and you go through a physical roller coaster that was Air, but you're in an alien environment. So it's all kind of 3D headset-y things. Sounds pretty cool.
I think they've ruined it, haven't they? Darren Brown's Ghost Train is what we were going for, and obviously it's been delayed a little bit, so we're going to go later on.
Mm-hmm.
You friends with Darren? Or is it more of an acquaintance?
I would like to think friends.
Yeah,
I suppose you'd better ask him. But yeah, I've known him for a long time, and so I would like to think of him as a friend. I think he's a great guy. I think he's an incredibly clever and talented guy, and I've always got on very well with him. So I hope we're friends.
He's my favourite magician in this country. So I would like to ask you, who is your favourite magician?
Does it have to be a living one, or my favourite magician of all time is Channing Pollock.
Give us a living one and a dead one. That'd be good.
Well, Channing Pollock is my obvious answer.
He's dead, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yes. I did get to meet him a few times before he died, which was great for me, very exciting for me. I suppose actually the obvious answer are the two people who influenced me most, which is Ricky Jay and Channing Pollock.
Right, yeah. He's alive.
Yes.
I did know that was a joke.
Yes.
Okay, that's very good. And can I ask, is there a type of magic that you enjoy watching, even if necessarily you don't do it yourself? If there's a type of magic, I'll tell you why I asked this. Is because about 15 years ago, you don't know this, but you were stood behind me in a queue, and you were going into a magic competition, and you were really excited about it. I remember you were like, "This is going to be great. It's going to go on for hours," and you were really excited. And I always remember that. I thought that's interesting because I hate competitions, and sometimes they can be difficult to watch. But is that the type of magic you like watching, competitions, or do you like...
Yeah, I do. I really like watching stage competition magic, and I can't really justify that or explain it, but it's just one of those things.
Right.
And as I said, in my heart, I feel like I've always wanted to be a stage magician, but I've never really been able to until possibly more recently. I might have had a chance to give it a go, but I can't stand watching close-up competitions for the most part. But it's partly through no fault of the organisers. It's just almost impossible for it really to be a close-up experience, and it's difficult to see. And I also find quite a lot of close-up magic, the presentation can be fairly clunky and generic, and I just find listening to people reeling out stock lines fairly tedious. Stage magic, a lot of it is done to music, which tends, I find, to be preferable often. I do really like watching stage magic, and I don't quite know why. And certainly a good stage magic competition, FISM, I can happily sit in that for hours. And then even a bad stage magic competition can have other attractions. There's something there's something kind of grand and dramatic about a really bad stage act, whereas just a really bad close-up act is usually just a bit dull. So you kind of get more of the extremes. So yeah, I do like watching stage competitions, and I like watching generally sort of manipulation things. And even, I was saying earlier, that I find a lot of manipulation magic confusing, and I don't think it's very effective for that reason. That doesn't necessarily stop me enjoying watching it from a sort of technical perspective or as a sort of geeky magician. So yeah, I do like watching that sort of stuff.
That's amazing. Can we play word association?
Oh, crikey.
Mike Caveney.
Well, it's difficult because I've got...
Well, he published your book. Yeah, I realised I was over it. He did publish it. 1999.
Yeah.
This one.
Funny.
Funny guy.
He's the funniest guy. He's the nicest guy, but also he's just hilariously funny. Not only on stage, but he's just one of the funniest and sharpest guys just to be around with what he comes out with.
Steve Wyrick.
Helicopters.
Sorry, that was brilliant. Sorry, that was my favourite part of the series so far. Have you seen this helicopter?
I feel like I must have done, but I don't know. It feels like the sort of thing one would have seen.
It's a brilliant helicopter. It's an AS350 helicopter.
Okay, I didn't know that.
He appears at the beginning of the show on the head. You should look it up, ladies and gents, if you've got a spare 2.5 minutes. Go to YouTube, Steve Wyrick helicopter, and he produces a big helicopter. It's brilliant.
Okay.
It's the best one I've seen. I've seen all the helicopters.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, look, I love Jamie Raven, but I'm sorry, I had nothing on Steve Wyrick's helicopter.
Yeah, some of the helicopters that I've seen don't appear to me to be airworthy. I can't imagine them actually taking
Is
off.
there a little side to you? I'm just, I'm trying to pick up on vibes here.
Mm-hmm.
A little side to you here that you sort of wish you were doing the helicopter illusion. You said you love stage magic.
Well, I should qualify that. When I say stage magic, I have only ever been interested in a sort of visual magic.
A helicopter.
A helicopter, yeah. I mean, I've just never really been interested in mentalism and that sort of stuff. Things have to happen that are visible. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the magician has to be responsible for the things happening. Now, again, that's sort of a terrible thing to say because, I know the magician is not supposed to display skill and you're not supposed to realise that it's done by sleight of hand or whatever. But and I'm not saying that makes for good magic. I'm just saying that's what I personally like. So I like stage manipulation and things where there is something going on with the magician. I understand there is a lot of skill involved in being a good illusionist, less so I imagine in being a bad one, but being I'm not trying to say that they're not proper magicians, far from it. I mean, I genuinely do recognise that it is a very difficult thing to do well, but no matter how well it is done, I do not feel when I watch it the sense that the magician is actually causing the thing to happen. So I can sit and admire the presentation and the performance, and I can sit and admire the fact that Jim Steinmeier or someone has been so brilliant as to come up with the thing, but just as a purely personal thing, I don't get that sense of the magician making it happen. So I've never had any desire to do stage illusions.
Yeah, I mean, you're right as well. Let's be honest, you're right. The only thing is, there's a chance the magician drove the van to the venue. So,
there's no chance he flew that helicopter to the venue because that helicopter ain't getting off the ground.
That's true. Okay, I'm sorry, we've taken up far too much of your time, but this has been brilliant. And also, I didn't realise you were really funny. You're really funny as well, which was brilliant. So we have a final question, which is, I think this is going to be interesting how you answer this. What do you think is the biggest problem with magic today? And do you have a solution? Can it be fixed?
Well, I think the biggest problem in magic today is in many ways the same as it's always been, which is that magic is actually really difficult. And I think probably we've kind of forgotten that. It's a bit of a cliche that everyone says, if you can think of an effect, there's always a way to come up with a method for it. And I really disagree with that. I think it's actually really difficult to come up with things that are genuinely fooling and baffling. And I think the main problem is that there is so much magic and most of it actually is not really terribly deceiving. And I think that we in our little world of magic sometimes kind of lose the ability to think critically about things because, I mean, obviously as magicians we know how most things are done, so the fact that you know how a trick is done is not really a good barometer whether it's a good or a bad trick. But I think there's a sense that we assume that all magic that's published or downloadable or available in a book or at a dealer or whatever it is, because it exists, it must be a legitimate trick. And the reality is, I think actually an awful lot of it really isn't terribly deceptive. And I don't know, but my sense is that an awful lot of magic that exists is a little bit second-rate and not really very very good, and yet people do it because it's available. And so I think the solution is either for there to be less magic, which is unlikely to happen, or for people to be a little bit more discerning and critical and not to assume that just because... I mean, when we go into a shop, if you go into a shop and buy a camera or something, you assume that it's going to take photographs because otherwise it wouldn't be on sale. But I don't think that exists in magic dealers. Things can exist in a magic shop or online that no one's ever actually performed and isn't really ever going to be performed, but it's just a thing that exists. And I think if you go into a magic shop with the mentality that you go into when you go into a photography shop, just assuming that what you're going to get will work, that's not necessarily a valid assumption. That's not to say that I'm saying people shouldn't buy whatever they want to or download whatever they want to. I'm very much a believer that people should do magic for whatever reason they like, and if they enjoy something as a hobby and they just enjoy working on new material, I think that's great. But in terms of actually putting on a show and doing magic that you want people to be deceived by, I think one needs to be more discerning.
That is a brilliant answer. That's my favourite answer to that question so far, and I agree completely as well, because you're right, there's some magic where I think we're kidding ourselves that they're not figuring it out, and every now and again actually someone will tell you as well that they've figured out a trick or whatever. So
mostly people are quite polite, and also often people don't exactly know how it's done, but there's just a sense that what you've done is a bit weird and really not terribly good, and it kind of gets by, but it's just not a very good trick. And I think there are a lot of those.
You talk about buying things, obviously, and you remember at the beginning I talked about buying my kettle today. I also bought a toaster today.
Did you?
As well, and like you said, I'm assuming that is going to make toast.
Exactly.
So I think that's the perfect way to...
I hope you didn't buy it from a magic shop.
No, but you can buy those toasters that put playing cards on the bread, can't you? You ever seen those? Brilliant. So it's like a dodgy toast. I don't know how it works, but it's a dodgy toast. You put the bread in, and when it comes out, it's got 7 of diamonds. It's the only bit not toasted. You not seen that before?
That one's passed me by, I have to say. I don't think KitchenAid make one of those.
Guy, this has been terrific. Thanks very much for agreeing to be on the podcast and for providing such great entertainment and insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Guy Hollingworth, ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Guy Hollingworth. What a hero. I was a bit out of my depth this week intellectually. I did my best. I'm sorry about that. Noel Britton once said that we're really lucky to have Guy in magic because he could be doing anything. I couldn't agree more. He could have been like Prime Minister or something, couldn't he? We're really lucky that he, does magic and shares his magic with us all. So if you ever get a chance to see him perform, go and do it. You won't regret it. He's incredible. And also, beg, borrow, steal, do whatever you have to do to get a copy of Drawing Room Deceptions. It's an amazing book. One of the few magic books I have actually read. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. It is time, ladies and gentlemen, for me to ride off into the sunset and wrap this podcast up. But don't fret, we'll be back again next Friday for a brand new episode of the Magicians Podcast. Have a great week. I will see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.